For the past couple of months, I've been playing a lot of Altered TCG, and today I'd like to tell you about my favorite mechanic in that game, that being the reserve. Altered is a new competitive trading card game in which you and your opponent play the role of leaders of competing expeditions into a dangerous, magical wilderness called the Tumult. Your goal is to have two of your expedition tokens, which start on the opposite ends of this track here, meet before your opponent's tokens do. You'll move those tokens at the end of a round if your characters in that expedition have higher stats than your opponents. And since there's two expeditions, you might see it coming that it's possible to move one, both, or none of your tokens within a round. In a turn, you'll play a character to one of the two expeditions and then pass initiative to the opponent, who will also get to play one card, and so on and so forth until you both run out of mana for the turn, or decide to pass. That's when the totals for each expedition are calculated, expedition tokens move, and where the mechanic of the reserve comes into play. Because at the end of the round, the board gets wiped. All the characters that you played that potentially gave you the win in one or both expeditions go into another zone, called, you might have guessed it, the reserve, from which they can be played again in future turns. There's two spaces for cards in there, and any cards beyond that need to be discarded at end of turn, much like is the case with hand size in MTG. For the ones that do stay in the reserve, you have the option of playing them again. However, when you do, they gain a debuff called Fleeting, and if they were to go to the reserve again, they'd be discarded instead. So to simplify it a bit, you get to play your cards twice, and the reserve serves as a kind of second public hand, or a graveyard that's easily accessible, depending on what sort of card game parallel you would have preferred here. And this wouldn't have been that groundbreaking in comparison to some other card games if it wasn't for how much of the game is built around this core concept. First of all, cards in reserve being public information is kind of a big deal here. Since you're playing cards interchangeably, and have the option of playing them in either of the two expeditions, but not both, responding to your opponent's plays is the key to victory. You might want to match their play, or you might want to be strong where they are weak, so a card in reserve being a known quantity immediately loses some of that surprise factor. But there is more. Each card in the game has two costs, one when played from hand, another when played from reserve. And when I'm played from reserve is one of the timing rules on the game's equivalent of battle cries or ETB effects. You've got the hand symbol, which means that the ability activates when the card is played from hand and only then, the shining card symbol, which means that it only activates from reserve, and arrow, which means it activates in both situations. Thus, you'll have cards that have a bigger impact when they are played from reserve than from the hand, making up for them being public and less of a surprise. Some cards may be cheaper or more expensive in reserve than in hand. And hell, in the last expansion, that was the core strategy for the hero Basira, where you would assemble a number of cards that can remove Fleeting, the debuff that means that you go to the graveyard next time you'd go to reserve, and a number of cards that buff whenever you play from reserve. And you would just cycle the same cards from reserve over and over. So we know that cards in reserve being public info is a big deal, we know that it's core to the game in that it allows a single card to behave differently depending on where you play it from, but what really made me take a liking to it is how many support mechanics they built on top of that. You've got Resupply, which allows you to put the top card of your deck in reserve, so kind of like drawing half a card, since it will be fleeting by the time you play it, so you'll only get to play it once instead of twice. You've got effects that have you put a card in reserve as part of their cost, which again puts you behind kind of half a card, since you won't be playing it from hand and then from reserve, but perhaps it's a card with a reserve effect that you want to play this turn, and putting it directly into reserve gets you access to it sooner. You've got support abilities, this bit of text in the colored background at the bottom here. You can discard a card with it from reserve for a one-shot effect that doesn't pass priority and has no associated cost. Well, apart from getting rid of the card, of course. So again, you'll be losing out on replaying the card, but that's an additional decision that you get to make. Perhaps that one-shot effect is worth it. You've got Fleeting, same name as the debuff, for cards that get discarded after first play, as if they had the debuff. This makes them excellent fodder for effects that have you put stuff in reserve, since you are not playing them twice in the first place. However, perhaps in certain situations you'd like to keep them in hand so your opponent can't play around them, especially since that fleeting keyword often appears on removal spells. You've got spells that send an opponent's already played character to reserve, which is a bounce effect when it targets a brand new character, but if played on a card with Fleeting, it becomes hard removal, lending itself to the occasional interesting decision between bouncing a stronger card or destroying a weaker one. And of course you've got Sabotage, discarding a card your opponent currently has in reserve, which creates a kind of game of chicken, where your opponent may want to play their reserve cards earlier in a round than they otherwise would have liked to prevent you from sabotaging them. And the latest expansion, Trial by Frost, presents even more twists on the general idea. A big theme of the X-Pack is exhausting cards in reserve, tapping them so that they can't be played for the turn but still clog one of the precious 2 reserve spots. Some cards ask you to do that to yourself as a cost, some allow you to do it to your opponent as disruption. This also presented the opportunity for twists on familiar mechanics from the base set, like Exhausted Resupply, where you resupply, then exhaust the card immediately so it can't be played this turn. This effect, however, is more competitively costed than the normal resupply. Or you've got cooldown. When this card enters reserve, it gets exhausted. I find it an elegant balancing method for cheap spells that could be a problem if you were able to play them twice per turn, but since they have cooldown, you cannot. However, it's a bit different from Fleeting, in that you will get to play them eventually. There's also exchanging cards from hand and reserve, reserve matters buffers or token generators, discarding cards in reserve as a cost, and a whole slew of one-off effects that mention the reserve in some capacity. We are currently 1 base set and 1 expansion in, and they've already done so much with the idea, and I still feel like there's design space left. Thanks a lot for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one.